Something she yearned for, by which her life might be filled with action at once rational and ardent. And since the time was gone by for guiding visions and spiritual directors, since prayer heightened yearning, but not instruction, what lamp was there but knowledge? George Eliot, Middlemarch. For many years, Julia Wise wondered if she would ever meet another person who thought as she did. Everyone she knew thought her ideas about morality and what she was duty-bound to do were strange. Most people just thought she was weird. Some people told her they thought she might be right, but they weren't willing to make the sacrifices she made. Other people thought her ideas were not only misguided, but actually bad. All this made her worry that she might be wrong. How likely was it that everyone else was wrong and she was right? But she was also suspicious of that worry. After all, it would be quite convenient to be wrong. She wouldn't have to give so much. Although her beliefs seemed to her not only reasonable but clearly true, and she could argue for them in a rational way, they were not entirely the result of conscious thinking. The essential impulse that gave rise to all the rest was simply a part of her. She couldn't help it. She had always been this way, since she was a child. Julia believed that because each person was equally valuable, she was not entitled to care more for her own well-being than for anyone else's. She believed that she was therefore obliged to spend much of her life working for the benefit of others. That was the core of it. As she grew older, she worked out the implications of this principle in greater detail. In college, she thought she might want to work in development abroad somewhere, but then she realized that probably the most useful thing she could do was not become a white aid worker telling people in other countries what to do, but instead earn a first world salary and give it to NGOs that could use it to pay for several local workers who knew what their countries needed better than she did. She became a social worker in Boston, and she loved her work. She had never been good at small talk, but the conversations she had with her clients were often deeply felt and about real things, and she hoped that at least sometimes they were of use. It felt good to extend sympathy and help to someone who wanted it, and who was sitting right there in front of her. But she knew that people in other parts of the world were worse off than even the people she worked with in prisons and mental hospitals. They were dying young from preventable diseases. They didn't have enough food or clean water. So she concluded that her donations to charities, which helped people far away whom she would never meet, were more important than her social work. She believed that if she was to be as helpful as possible, she had to think about what people most needed rather than what gave pleasure to give. What was important was that people were helped, not that it was she who was doing the helping. She reduced her expenses to the absolute minimum so she could give away most of what she earned. She gave to whichever charity seemed to her, after researching the matter, to relieve the most suffering for the least money, which usually meant medical interventions in Third World. Because she earned the salary of a social worker, she could not give very much, but year after year, and over her lifetime, she knew it would add up to quite a lot, hundreds of thousands of dollars, which meant that many children who might have died young from some easily cured disease might instead survive and live a normal span of life. Julia has experienced depression in the past, and even now that she has been happy for several years and is often funny, the dregs of her sadness still cling to her. She is cautious and reserved, and you can imagine the doors of herself closing very tightly to the point where no light at all can enter. Suffering can cause a person to turn inward, to become so preoccupied with his own pain that he loses sight of other people. But it did not have this effect on Julia. Her depression has made her viscerally conscious of suffering in others in a way that most naturally happy people are not. She is young, 30, but not so young that her youth accounts for any of her beliefs. She is long past the age where most people forget or distort or reject the terrible simplicity of the rules they learned as children. Despite her extreme frugality, Julia is not an ascetic. She loves material things as much as anyone. She loves fireworks and ice cream. She loves to cook. She loves to sew clothes and to make elaborate old-fashioned hats out of scraps. She gets pleasure out of things like that. She doesn't get pleasure out of giving money. To her, giving is simply a duty, like not stealing, so it doesn't beget a feeling of virtue. If all were well with the world, she would like to live on a farm somewhere and keep animals and grow pumpkins and runner beans and sunflowers in the garden. She would sew curtains and read and bake pies and have children. But all is not well with the world. It occurred to Julia when she was quite young that she would be hellish to be married to. She was unwilling to compromise on moral questions, which meant, for instance, that she was unwilling to spend money on things that it was normal for married people to spend money on. And yet, when she was 22, having fallen in love with a young man named Jeff Kaufman, she proposed to him, and they became engaged. Jeff knew about her principles, but money questions did not come up much while they were still in college, because their food and shelter were taken care of. And so it happened that the first real moral test of their life together did not arise until after graduation. It was a sunny day in September, and they were at an apple orchard outside Boston with Julia's Morris dancing troupe. There were candy apples for sale, and Julia wanted one. Normally, she would have told herself that she could not justify spending her money that way. But Jeff had told her that if she wanted anything, he would buy it for her with his money. He had found a job as a computer programmer. Julia was still unemployed and didn't have any savings because she had given everything she'd earned in the summer to Oxfam. Jeff bought the apple. Julia: "It was like maybe $4? Jeff: "No." Julia: "It was one of those orchards." Jeff: "A $4 candy apple?" Julia: "I don't know." Jeff: "I would feel bad about that." Julia: "Maybe it was 3? Jeff: "I don't think it was that much." Julia: "I'm sure it's in the spreadsheet." That night, they lay in bed and talked about money. Jeff told Julia that, inspired by her example, he was thinking of giving some percentage of his salary to charity. And Julia realized that if Jeff was going to start giving away his earnings, then by asking him to buy her the apple, she had spent money that might have been given. With her selfish, ridiculous desire for a candy apple, she might have deprived a family of an anti-malarial bed net or deworming medicine that might have saved the life of one of its children. The more she thought about this, the more horrific and unbearable it seemed to her, and she started to cry. She cried for a long time, and it got so bad that Jeff started to cry too, which he almost never did. He cried because, more than anything, he wanted Julia to be happy. But how could she be happy if she went through life seeing malarial children everywhere, dying before her eyes for want of a bed net? He knew that he wanted to marry her, but he wasn't sure how he could cope with a life that was going to be this difficult and this sad, with no conceivable way out. Then they stopped crying and talked about budgets. They realized that Julia was going to lose her mind if she spent the rest of her life weighing each purchase in terms of bed nets. So, after much discussion and fine-tuning, they came up with a system. In the weeks and months that followed, they refined it, adjusting its incentives and allowances, addressing its inequities. The first and most crucial element of the system was that henceforth, Jeff's money and Julia's money would be considered entirely separate. Once that was established, they could decide to do with their own money what they wished. Jeff decided he would give away 50% of his salary and keep the rest for spending and saving. Julia would give away 100% of hers. Out of the remainder of Jeff's salary, he allotted an allowance to each of them of $38 a week, which they would use to pay for everything other than rent and food. Things such as clothes, shoes, transportation, and treats like candy apples. Jeff decreed that this allowance had to be spent on these things. It could not be given away, and it could not be saved, or he would donate a matching amount to the Republican Party. That way, if Julia wanted to spend money on something, she would not be taking that money away from someone who was dying. Julia realized, of course, that this wall they had set up between his money and hers existed only in their heads. But since its only function was to preserve her sanity, that didn't matter. Having figured out a system, they stuck to it with rigor. They kept track of every purchase, however tiny, and entered it into a spreadsheet. After a year, they realized that giving away 50% of Jeff's salary before taxes, they had forgotten taxes, while paying rent and student loans, and giving away 100% of Julia's salary was basically impossible. So they adjusted the amount to 30%. In 2009, they spent $15,688 on themselves and donated $28,309. In 2010, they spent $20,591 and donated $36,056. In 2011, they spent $17,959 and donated nothing because Julia was paying for social work school and Jeff was taking much of his salary in stock options. In 2012, they spent $12,107. Their rent was less because they moved in with Jeff's parents, and donated $49,933. At some point, they decided to merge their finances and donate 50% of their joint pre-tax income. They also realized that it made sense to buy a house and rent part of it out, rather than pay rent themselves. Because they earned more, they were now giving away more than ever before, both proportionally and in absolute terms, despite buying the house. In 2014, they donated $127,556. Once their financial system was in place, they spent some time looking into various organizations, with the goal of finding the most effective charity, which they defined as the one that relieved the most suffering for the fewest dollars. At first, they settled on Oxfam. They liked that it employed a lot of local workers rather than just NGO types from abroad. They liked that it focused on long-term development rather than disaster relief. Later, They heard about an organization called Give Well, which evaluated charities in terms not of how little they spent on overhead, a silly measure, since overhead costs, such as efficacy research, might be money well spent, but of how effective they were at saving and improving lives. GiveWell promoted groups like the Against Malaria Foundation, which distributed bed nets, and the Schistosomiasis Control Initiative, which administered cheap deworming treatments. People were always telling Julia and Jeff that they ought to help those in their own community first, before sending money abroad. But they thought that was wrong. For one thing, money went so much further in other countries, so it could help many more people. And then, why were strangers in Somerville or some other nearby town any more their own than strangers in Malawi? They wondered. It made no sense. All their donations and self-imposed frugality meant that Julia and Jeff thought about money quite a lot. And some people found this off-putting, especially since the amounts involved were relatively small. There was a grandeur to extremely large donations, and to the high aims that those sums made possible, so that the moneyness of the money tended to fade into invisibility beside the dazzling ambition of the idea. But smaller sums seemed petty. They remained only money, defined by the ordinariness of what the amount could buy in the first world. A pair of shoes, car, rather than the value of what it could buy somewhere else. Food, medicine. Small renunciations could make a person seem small rather than good. And what could those small sums actually do? It was true that nothing could really change without the action of governments. Julia and Jeff knew that development alone was limited at best, and at its worst could be actively harmful. But they thought that if they worked hard to find the charities that were doing the most effective work, and gave them as much money as they possibly could, then over the years, it would be worth it. Enabling some lives to be less stunted was as much as a regular person could hope to do, they thought, even if larger systemic evils persisted. The point was to try to make sure the money did something useful, and not to become all pure and martyrish about it, and start thinking about self-deprivation as an end in itself. They had read about a man named Charles Gray who had decided to restrict himself to what he called the World Equity Budget. His budget was much smaller than theirs, and that impressed them. But they thought it was silly that Charles Gray seemed to think it was more important that he be poor than that others be less so. They felt sad that a strong moral impulse should have been squandered in such a useless manner. It was not, after all, the thought that counted when it came to doing good in the world. It was a dull way of giving, writing checks, rather than, say, becoming an aid worker in a distant country. There was a moral glamour in throwing over everything and leaving home and going somewhere dangerous that compensated for all sorts of privations. There was no glamour in staying behind, earning money, and donating it. It certainly wasn't soul-stirring to be thinking about money all the time. But so much depended on money, they knew. It took a callous kind of sentimentality to forget that. Money well spent could mean years of life, and money spent badly meant years of life lost. Julia, people are really bad at thinking of money and lives as interchangeable, but they are. Like today at work, we were talking about the teenager who decided to sail around the world and then had to be airlifted out of the Indian Ocean. How much money was spent on saving that one life? And there are other situations where we spend huge amounts on some expensive medical procedure, and we're willing to think of that life as infinitely precious, but we're also willing to stand by while lots of people die for stupid and preventable reasons. I think we should think about how things would be if we had to treat sick people equally, rather than keeping a lot of them hidden in Haiti. I heard on the news that a second person died in Arizona after being denied an organ transplant because the state cut 1.4 million from its transplant program. All I could think was, that much money and only 2 people died. The summer after Jeff graduated from college, the summer before the candy apple incident, he and Julia worked at Pinewoods, a folk dance and music camp. Jeff washed dishes, Julia was a cook. Together, they saved about $5,000, which they donated to Oxfam. While they were working at the camp, it seemed to them that this was a good way to spend the summer. They were living simply, spending nothing, helping other people with hard menial work, and saving the money they earned to give away. But after the summer was over and Jeff started donating, it occurred to him that they could have earned considerably more by doing something else, which would have enabled them to give more. Had that summer then been a self-indulgence? Did they have the right to spend 3 months of their expensively educated lives playing peasants by the seaside, earning almost nothing? Was there really any difference between choosing not to earn more money and spending their money on a new sofa or fancy clothes? Had they, in effect, been paying with the suffering of other people for the privilege of feeling wholesomely poor? It was bad enough to worry about these questions in retrospect, but they became far more pressing when Julia had to think about a career. She wanted to be a social worker. She had wanted to for years, but she could earn far more money doing something else. Was it okay for her to be a social worker anyway? How much was she entitled to consider her own happiness? She could justify not going for the absolute maximum she could earn on the grounds that she would be so crushingly miserable in finance or law that she would have a breakdown within a few years. And then she'd be out the cost of law school or business school or whatever it took to get into the field in the first place. She knew that pushing herself past what she could endure wasn't going to help anyone. A career had to be sustainable over the long haul. But obviously, there were lots of jobs that paid less than finance, but more than social work. She struggled with this question for a long time. And though she never did come up with a satisfactory answer, she enrolled in social work school anyway. All of this was much less of a problem for Jeff. If he had married someone other than Julia, he thought, he probably would not be spending much more than he was now. He would just be saving the extra rather than giving it away. He wanted to have a pot of money in reserve, so he would have more options in the future, and so that if anything bad happened to his family, he would be able to help. If he hadn't married Julia, he would have spent a bit more on nicer instruments. He especially coveted a new fiddle. And he would have felt freer to quit his job and do something else that paid less. Perhaps he would have become a full-time musician or a folk dance caller. But other than that, his life would be basically the same. He figured he would enjoy any number of different jobs, so he felt free to pick the highest paid one. He liked working as a programmer, and he imagined that if he had no charitable duties, he would probably be doing something similar. It wasn't hard to make him happy. While Julia was working on her social work degree, it occurred to her that she might have enjoyed being a psychiatrist, and psychiatrists earned much more than social workers. That was what she should have done with her life, she realized. But the thought of investing vast sums of money and many years of her life on pre-med courses and then medical school, and many years of her life on pre-med on years in which she had reason to believe she would be utterly miserable, it wouldn't be able to do anything at all, was too awful to contemplate. Later still, it occurred to her that she could earn more money within social work by becoming one of the despised subspecies that adjudicated claims for insurance companies, those who spent their time denying sick people coverage. The work would be awful, but it would enable her to give a lot more without requiring any additional training. So did she have the right to turn away from it? The trouble was she loved her job. Her first position was as a counselor in a prison. Much of the time, she couldn't do very much for the people she talked to. They were in prison after all. But many of them were so miserable there, and so desperate for kindness, that she saw that just listening to them and being supportive meant quite a bit. And once in a while, she felt that something she had said had really helped. One person in the prison was the daughter of an alcoholic father who had died from the effects of drinking. The father had always told his daughter that her bad behavior had driven him to drink, and the daughter felt dreadful guilt about this. Julia said, "What if your father had told his AA group that he drank because of you, that it was all your fault?" The daughter at once saw how wrong that would sound to other people and felt her guilt ease. Moments like that made Julia happy, but she was careful not to let herself get carried away. She was there to think about what her clients needed, not what made her feel good. She wrote in her blog, "This is an ad for a food bank that appears on buses all over Boston. Here we have a pretty young white woman hugging an older white woman. I guess the young woman is supposed to represent the food bank since she looks happy, whereas the faceless older woman is presumably hungry and therefore in need of comfort. Oh wait, except she doesn't need a hug. She needs groceries. I have a rescue fantasy, what social worker doesn't. Somewhere inside, we love to believe that we could just hug our clients and make everything better. If we took them home and gave them a good meal and enough sympathy, we believe we could fix everything and earn their undying gratitude. But that is an inside thought. You do not tell your clients about that. The point is to help, not to feel helpful. If I needed groceries, would I really want to go someplace where I might get hugged by some misty-eyed young lady with a savior complex? No way.